I am super excited for this next conversation. We have Nick Sinai. He is the former US Deputy CTO, also a senior advisor at Insight Partners, a software investor, and perhaps my favorite part, author of Hack Your Bureaucracy. I'm biased because the story of my journey is in here, as are many others. So super excited to have him here. Everybody welcome Nick Sinai. Thanks. All right, so one of the first things that I want to talk about is what inspired you to write this book, and what impact do you want it to have?
Yeah, so thank you for having me. This is an awesome conference, by the way. So I spent 4 years in the White House, in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, in the CTO's office. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the bureaucracy of the White House, that is kind of the outer echelon, right? We had very little escalation dominance, as we called it, right? The only policy council, perhaps less on the totem pole, was the Council on Environmental Quality over at Jackson Place, right? And we would always watch people, some be tremendously successful. One of my bosses was Todd Park, the US Chief Technology Officer. He's co-founded 3 multi-billion-dollar market cap companies, helped create the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, USDS, led the healthcare.gov rescue, et cetera. You'd see some people like that who are tremendously successful, but you see other people who were, successful entrepreneurs, successful executives, successful in other realms, come in and fail miserably, right? And so we'd always, try and think about, like, why are some people successful and why are some people just struggling? We just kind of collected a bunch of practices, and some of them were quite simple, about writing a one-pager or giving credit liberally. And some of them were probably like less obvious, about stabbing people in the chest, disagreeing with people candidly and speaking the hard truths. And so we just would write these down. We actually had a whiteboard for all 8 years. I only spent 4 years there, but there was a whiteboard there for 8 years that at the end of the Obama administration, they actually took out, probably breaking a few rules. And we were just inspired to kind of help other folks, because we had, a lot of this is my co-author's successes and my failures. And so, I also have the privilege of teaching as an adjunct at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I have a lot of younger students. And so, I feel like I'm telling a lot of these stories, and so wanted to put them all down into a book, and hope you all pre-order, because it comes out next week.
Yeah, so I kind of want to follow the flow of the book. You outlined it in kind of a journey here, and step 1 is defining the problem, which always seems obvious, but it's striking how often it doesn't happen. So what are some maybe some surprises or folks that got it really got it right?
Yeah, so there's a chapter about getting out of the office. It's particularly pernicious if you are in headquarters or in the White House, right? There's all this discussion about policy to help veterans, but people don't actually go out and spend time understanding the problem from a veteran's perspective. So my co-author, Marina Nitsa, she was the CTO of the VA. She talks about this very humbling experience where she was on a bench at a Menlo Park VA, and she was talking to the spouse of a veteran who had been hospitalized for close to a year. And it was only in talking to this spouse did she realize that this particular veteran had no idea that there's a whole range of financial and other benefits that the VA provided. They thought it was just a healthcare system, right? And so it's this getting out of the office, all the stuff we've been talking about this morning about how do you get closer to the actual user. And I think especially in the policy world, there's such crappy feedback loops, right? And one of my favorite bureaucracy hackers and good friends, Erie Meyer, who's now the chief technologist at the FTC, she likes to tell this story about, at the CFPB, they were chartered to do a home disclosure regulation, whereas basically requiring every mortgage to come with a 2-page document that you may have signed. And so typically the way this would work is the regulator would say this is required, maybe they would be very prescriptive about it, and then that would just go happen. But what they actually did is they did workshops in person and online across the country and actually user tested a particular disclosure form. So over 100,000 people gave feedback about how readable this particular form was. And so by the time the banks actually rolled out, and now when you get a 2-page home disclosure form that is mandated by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, it is because it's been user tested, not because, but that particular form has been user tested before it went live, right? And so it's like, how do you get that kind of user input, even in the policy and bureaucracy parts of government?
Yeah. This next one is near and dear to my heart. I said yesterday that you can't hack a system that you don't understand. So the next section that you have is knowing your organization. And you said something at the beginning that I think is really important, and I wonder if it relates to this, which is some leaders come out of commercial and really succeed. Others come and really muck things up. And my observation has been that it depends on if they've had experience hacking bureaucracy themselves. You could hire a senior engineer out of Amazon that wasn't there when Vogel went through and pushed them to a service-oriented architecture and made this huge architectural and cultural change. So what are some of the observations that you all found in knowing the organization?
Yeah, I think you have to understand how the org chart really works. You have to understand what people's incentives are, what the risks are, right? And so that was just something that was painfully obvious to us, is to understand, what is really motivating people. I mean, maybe this seems as kind of like organizational behavior 101, but when people talk about risk, you want to really understand what is it that they're solving for. What's really on their mind, and that sometimes is not obvious in a memo. It's not obvious in a particular meeting. I'll tell you a funny story about risk and knowing your org. We actually opened the book with this. My co-author Marina, she's in a cabinet meeting. So there's a quarterly cabinet meeting about Veterans Affairs, and if you think back about a decade ago, the VA was on newspapers and headlines. Daily Show was giving the VA a lot of crap because the floors were literally buckling because of the weight of the claims, right? And Marina she's a 28-year-old senior executive service. So we broke a few rules by having a 28-year-old SES. She goes in there and she's told to go fix the VA, and she's given no budget, no authority, no people. She couldn't even buy a $150 whiteboard when she got there because it exceeded her budget. Plus, you had to have a union-approved person to put it on the wall, et cetera. So she's in this, you fast forward a little bit, she's in this cabinet meeting, and President Obama calls her out, and he's like, "Why aren't you shipping software faster? Like, what's going on?" And so she sits there and she tries to explain this new process that the VA is struggling to approve. And so he thinks about it for a little bit, and he says, would it be helpful if I recorded a video telling everyone that they had to approve this particular process? And Marina says, "Thank you, Mr. President. I'll come back to you if that's necessary." And she ultimately didn't take him up on that offer, but it's that epiphany that we start with, which is the leader of the free world could not make the VA move any faster in shipping software. The leader of the free world could not make the VA ship software faster. It was up to Marina, up to Alex, and a bunch of really talented colleagues to figure out how that organization worked, to band together with unlikely allies. That's another key theme in the book. Is I feel like we're talking to the converted here, right? But is building those authentic relationships with those allies to make progress. And one other quick story. One of the challenges in getting the VA to the cloud was because they wanted to put the cloud in an evidence bag. And so the security professionals were used to, when there was malfeasance, coming and taking your computer, your server, what have you, and putting it in a literal evidence bag for forensics, for the investigation. And they were not going to sign off on the VA moving to the cloud until they could figure out how to get the cloud in an evidence bag. And she had to sit down with them, getting back to your risk question, and talk about how you can actually do forensics in the cloud, which may seem obvious to everyone here. There's much more data and so forth. But for a group that was so used to the idea of physically taking the computer, the server or the laptop, and putting it in an evidence bag and getting them comfortable with their ability to do that forensics, that was actually the blocker to the VA moving to the cloud.
That's fascinating. I don't even know what to say. I think we came up with the definition of Prodacity, right? Being willing to take bold personal risks to ship outcomes to prod. Because there's actually, we're not actually, or we shouldn't be, forcing the organization to take on more risk. Everybody says that we need to be more risk tolerant. We're actually very risk tolerant today, we just don't know it. We're like risk ignorant, maybe.
We like to fail in large, slow ways rather than small ways.
Yeah, we turn like multi-million-dollar failures into like billion-dollar successes, and we go from there. But as I'm hearing this story about your co-author, like what was the personal risk like? Did she? I mean, it sounds like she had very high level, leader of the free world, top cover in a sense, but even that sometimes isn't top cover.
No, and when she first got to the VA. She talks about no one would take any of her meetings because everyone kind of assumed. She had actually done a red teaming of the VA from the White House, from the CTO's office. So she had just written a report that basically talked about all the warts of the organization. And then she was installed as over plenty of objections, no doubt, as the new CTO, who hadn't finished college, was 28 years old, in a very bureaucratic, military-esque culture, right? And she couldn't get meetings with other executives, right? Because they knew that she was going to start asking hard questions, right? And she started off by solving a small problem, and that was the executive assistants and secretaries basically track signatures in these green folders, and they would always pop into people's offices and say, have you seen this particular green folder, because you have to get a lot of people to sign off on a particular correspondence or policy change or something like that. And she found some surplus barcode scanners in a closet and basically made this little app that let them scan inventory control for signatures, right? And this seems so antiquated, but this was probably 2012, 2013. And all the executive assistants loved it because it allowed them to track the signatures, and this was their core work, one of their core workflow. They called the app MBoop, and suddenly she could get on anyone's calendar, and she understood where the real power in the VA was, and that was the start of her gaining more and more access, and she solved small problems that turned into bigger problems to the point where she eventually was given a whole group of folks, started the US Digital Service, the VA team, which Alex was another leader of here, and that's what changed the digital experience for veterans. And now VA trust, or veteran trust in the VA, has gone up by 25 percentage points over a 5-year time frame. And the digital experience is a small but meaningful piece of why that trust has gone up, because Marina, Alex, and so many of their colleagues gained the trust of other people inside of the VA, including unlikely allies, to make those changes, to get approval to do automated testing. There's a funny story about automated testing in the book, which I'll let you guys read. So yeah, it is that starting with the paperclip. That story about trading from a paperclip to a house. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that apocryphal story. But that's what Marina was doing, was starting with folder tracking, which was not what she was hired to do. The chief technology officer of a Fortune 10 enterprise isn't charted with inventory tracking for signatures, but start small and build that momentum and trust.
Yeah, so that combines kind of two segments, right? Also pitching the solution, and so pitch the solution, start small, build momentum. What my observation has been is that a lot of folks one, they don't think they can start until they pitch a big solution, and it has to have AI, ML, and maybe blockchain in it, Web3 now.
Hopefully not.
And there are valid use cases. I pick on those a lot, but there are valid use cases for those, but we're still struggling to get the majority of the federal government to the cloud. So it seems like something very few number of people should be focusing on. And everybody thinks that even, Kessel Run, like, oh, they just were handed this. They went and pitched and they got all the money, but it actually didn't work that way. We had to start very small and earn every dollar. So we're going to talk later on in the conference about hacking those bureaucracies around funding and around the procurement process. But everybody assumes that you have to get all those up front. And you're saying, no, you don't actually need those authorities. The leader of the free world can't even probably give them to you. So you actually have to build a kind of a coalition of the willing.
It is totally a coalition of the willing. The interesting thing about Kessel Run is initially Enrique Odi, one of your co-founders, had a little bit of money to investigate rebuilding the entire Air Operations Center. So I think General Bender gave him $100K, and he had hired some consultants, and they were thinking about rebuilding this massive system. Many of you are probably familiar with it. That is essentially air traffic control and air operations for the Air Force, right? And it wasn't until the idea of focusing on a very discrete, small piece of it, tanker refueling, and being able to prove and get that into production in a matter of months, that kind of helped kickstart this, or the growth all the way to 1,200 people, which you guys were instrumental with, and Adam I see here as well. And the funny thing about that is there's a timing piece to bureaucracy hacking, right? Is people may have tried to do DevSecOps in government before, and probably were doing it before. And sometimes it takes a crisis. Sometimes it takes a failure. And Admiral Richardson was talking about this, of we don't want a Pearl Harbor, but sometimes you do need things to go wrong. And this was very much true for us in the Obama administration, where the healthcare.gov, the failure of the president's signature domestic achievement, basically was that helped catalyze the start of the U.S. digital service, right, and the Defense Digital Service and the VA digital service and all of these teams. It was only because you had a $500 million program, or a program that needed another $500 million, that was building on requirements from a decade and a half ago and still wasn't going to deliver for another 5 years. That kind of failure that both Congress and the Air Force leadership knew, that kind of created some opportunity to show a better way.
Yeah, one personal thing I'll share about that too is hopefully Enrique would agree with me, and if not, he can hit me later. But I think both he and I were raised in a culture in the military that both of us couldn't have figured out how to start small properly. What's interesting about that story too is the person that pitched, because Enrique did want to build the big thing, and I agreed with him. We also wanted to do a whole bunch of other crazy large things, and Eric Schmidt, who leads one of the largest enterprises in the world, and his organization invented Kubernetes and leads the world in like AI and ML. He's the one that said, no, this is your problem. This little whiteboard, similar to the folder, right? This whiteboard is the problem you need to solve first. And I think it's so interesting. Enrique and I sometimes get fashioned as mavericks, but we were just as much a part of this bad culture. And I think it did take some outside observation to realize that.
Yeah, we like to think about big changes, and I'm all for big changes. I'm on one of these fancy blue ribbon commissions now, thinking about defense reform, innovation, kind of stuff. But you have to start small, especially if you're inside the bureaucracy or alongside it, because there's always this big digital transformation, big strategic plan. Bureaucracies are in this kind of constant state of planning, and the trick is, can you carve off pieces of it, or can you align with it while trying to get your thing going, and then make some changes to the rules that make life better for, that actually allow that scale.
Yeah, and that requires a team. We talked a lot yesterday about teams and what the right kinds of teams look like. I'm curious, you have a phrase in here, cultivate the Karass, and I'm curious what that means, and what are some of the good patterns you've seen to do that?
Yeah, so the Karass is a term in Kurt Vonnegut's book. And it's basically an informal team, right? So it's not just the group that is your particular organization, but it is a set of informal allies, maybe destined to make an impact, right? And so I was always a big fan of this concept of cultivating the Karass, because like Marina, I didn't have very many people reporting to me. Actually, I had like 1 or 2 people, and yet I sat atop this large federal bureaucracy, right? And so it's this question of, can you find people, can you lift up people, can you work together with groups to go faster together? And so, the book is all about like the how. And so one of the hows is people flow. Can you find ways to flow people into and out of organizations at a faster rate and bring that kind of energy? And so that's one of the reasons we started the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program, was to flow technologists and entrepreneurs into government, right? And pair them. We were working on open data policy. So how do we make data more open, machine readable to the American public? Taking a page out of the GPS and weather data plays. And so, we're writing this fancy policy, executive order and OMB policy, et cetera. But we had this saying in the White House that, policy is not self-executing, right? And it's just a piece of paper that OMB puts out that you guys all ignore. And so we have to find ways to make it mean something and for it to actually be useful. And so putting talented entrepreneurs and technologists inside of the federal bureaucracy paired up with those change agents. And I think that's critical, which some people don't realize, is we really found those people who were doing great things inside particular agencies, lifted them up and paired them together with Presidential Innovation Fellows. And then we were able to say, okay, now we'll give you the policy and the top cover and the White House celebration and the data jams and data paloozas and all that kind of stuff. But it fundamentally was about flowing people into teams where there were already change agents and people who were trying to get good things done. So people flow is one of my favorite techniques. Another one is to find the people that have failed in the past, because you may think your idea is so great, and but if you actually go and find people who have tried that idea and failed, and you understand why it failed. Mm-hmm. And then actually, if you can convince them that now is a time to take another run at it, you're going to have a powerful set of allies who are going to steer you away from the minefields. When the bureaucracy comes to them and says, didn't we try this again? They will say, yes, and here's why we're going to learn and do something different.
Love that. I want to touch back on that piece you talked about pairing. We're partial to pairing. Pair programming, but just paired everything, including pairing on leadership. So I'm glad you brought that up. And when we hire for pairing, it's different than hiring for delivery. The skills are fundamentally different. These people, they might actually have less technical skills than some of their peers, but they have a lot of change management and soft skills. Maybe the next panel will talk about this, but I'm curious, have you seen any initiatives to get after that difference that you mentioned between the change agents and the people that have the technical know-how to execute?
I do think you have to put them together, and I think that's absolutely key. And I think that was part of the Kessel Run success story, right? Is you had the entrepreneurs and the technologists all together, people who also understood kind of acquisitions and the way kind of conventional DoD works. My observation is that and I sit on a number of boards now and advise some other companies, that the CEO of most companies is not the most technical person. And oftentimes they're not the most product person. I mean, we kind of have this idea that the Uber product manager, the founder, is going to become the CEO. Oftentimes that's the case early on, but as companies grow, sometimes that's not the case, right? Mm-hmm. And so, but you have people who are great entrepreneurs leading private sector startups, and their ability to really attract other people, attract capital to set that vision, and get everyone moving together. And so the question is, can you pair that kind of entrepreneurial activity with the people who are say, well, boss, you're getting over your skis, we're unable to deliver on that, or let's see what the users actually say, right? Because I know you're excited about this particular concept. I mean, we tell the story about the White House was launching the education scorecard. And so it was this idea to compare college costs and help people get a better sense of what higher education costs, help underprivileged communities better match to four-year institutions, and built on a rich data set that the US government collects. There was actual feature requests from the West Wing. That is, not only the West Wing, but the New York Times would write articles about how this should be, and the West Wing had ideas about what the feature requests should be, right? And so it took a small team from the US Digital Service and Department of Energy. They had cardboard prototypes they made out of cardboard, out of trash. And they took that on the mall, they took that into DC neighborhoods, and they tested it with teenagers and other people, families, and they found that a compare button was not something that teenagers actually wanted to do, right? So it was, and then you have to go back to the West Wing and explain to them and show them the data, which is another theme and the theme of this morning, right? Of show them the data that the teenagers don't care about that particular feature that both the West Wing and the New York Times think is so important.
Yeah, that's there's a lot we could touch on there. I want to make sure we leave time for questions. So the one thing I'll maybe ask there is, how do you, or maybe this is part of your Karass, like maybe, in fact, a lot of people don't know this, but during my time at Ketchum, I got in trouble a lot. I was very, or slightly insubordinate, we'll say. And
I find that hard to believe.
well, I would reach out to news outlets. I would contact professional staff members. I had an informal network in the DIB that would get things pushed into policy. I mean, we had touch points, and I wasn't the only one. There were other folks that I won't name in case they could get in trouble retroactively. But is that part of it? Do we need to be getting those people so they're not, contra to our objectives?
Well, one, I think every function has to understand how important building, buying, and integrating software is to government service delivery and to defense. And so I think that's just like full stop. And that means that HR, acquisition, legal, whatever the function is in government has to understand how important software is to mission, whatever that mission is, whether it's defense or service delivery, even the regulatory state. I was a big fan of building allies across functions. And I think that is one a very effective bureaucracy hack, and something that we actually talk a lot about. And if you befriend your comms person, they're going to trust you and let you go talk maybe off the record more and build relationships with reporters. If your ledge affairs trust you, they're going to let you participate up on the Hill. I tell the story about I was going behind the back of ledge affairs at the FCC when I first came into federal service, and I was very proud that some of my recommendations of this Blue Ribbon Task Force, the National Broadband Plan, were incorporated into Congressman Markey had a bill, and he invited me to testify, and of course the answer was no, because I had been going behind the back of legislative affairs. And so I'm a big fan of how do you build relationships across tribes, across guilds, across functional areas, and the more that you actually have those interactions, the more they get to trust you, and then you guys can get something together done.
Yeah, I agree. My approach was less than ideal. I did get found out a couple of times, and it led to the very negative consequences you mentioned. All right, I want time for hopefully 2, maybe 3 questions. Just shout it out. I'll repeat it so that we don't have to mic everyone. Any questions?
You talked about the importance of measuring what matters. What framework did you use for deciding what to measure?
Yeah. What framework did you use to decide what to measure?
So the White House actually has a real lack of data. And I think is incredibly frustrating, where you'd say, well, what's the evidence of this? And there'd be a lot of hemming and hawing, and they'd be like, okay, well, we'll do a data call. And so the Office of Management and Budget is going to send out a request for data, and then it will come back in 8 to 12 weeks. And so you have these long feedback cycles just to answer those certain kinds of policy questions. And we measured things a lot of times the wrong way. In the open data initiatives, we started measuring in the very early part of the administration how many data sets were on data.gov. Guess what? Agencies started chopping up data sets and putting more useless data rather than the high value data, the high value APIs that entrepreneurs, researchers, scientists, nonprofits, whoever actually needed. So we fell into a lot of those traps of measuring, but we made that course correction and we said, hey, we're no longer going to highlight how many data sets we're putting on data.gov because that was not a useful metric.
Yeah, and I'll take a stab too. I think I've learned a lot. Early on, I was all about the top 5 DORA metrics. I think those are really good, and specifically from a leadership perspective. If you're down at the team level, you should be diving into the 24 plus key capabilities that they define and accelerate and figuring out why those lagging metrics are problematic, but leadership looking at those. I think, though, I've become a convert on what Dominica talked about, Mick Kirsten's work and her work in identifying flow and the data sets that they use, and I would highly recommend implementing those at every level and making them very visible, and trying to keep the mission outcomes actually separate and distinct. They're important, but how do you compare the software that runs the nuclear button and has like 2 users to a chat tool that you deploy across the entire federal government? You just can't make meaningful comparisons. So those have to be done at a more localized level. And I would say it's a big error that we're making because we're making funding decisions about like, this is more important than this. It's like, it has more users. It's not a great metric, so.
I would say that the data is not often apparent to senior leaders.
Yeah.
And so the more that you can make that data about performance, around uptime, around flow, around usability, customer satisfaction, all of those kinds of things matter, but those things get filtered, unfortunately, by things like PowerPoint and those kinds of things. So it's incredibly powerful when you can show live data of like, hey, here's how many transactions got processed today. Here was the average and the median customer satisfaction score today. Here's how many veterans were served today, and this kind of thing. And we tried to do some of that. You could see the analytics on who was on what website with GSA had a analytics site so you could actually see some of the web traffic. But where you really want to go, at least in the service delivery side, is understanding what transactions and what pieces of information were delivered, and was that actually meeting the user need.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I'm going to exercise privilege, sorry, Aaron, and ask one final question. The last section in the book, making it stick. I feel like we stood on the shoulders of giants like 18F and larger TTS, NGA. Then there's Kessel Run. There's all these software factories that come. There's things that have come up in parallel, like Lighthouse organization inside the VA, and several other really great digital teams. I think most of them would agree with me in saying it still doesn't feel like it's sticking. It feels like it looks like it's sticking to everybody because it's been going for a long time. Kessel Run 5 years now, 18F much longer. But it's just that everybody's still pushing that rock up the hill. Do you agree with that assessment, or do you see, and really challenge me here, do you see some hope and some examples of really making it stick?
Yeah, so I do see some hope. We have made some progress, but we still have a long ways to go because we still do things in these long funding cycles, right? And so we talk about agile software delivery, and you have little, with full respect, these little units that are doing agile software delivery, both government and great support contractors. But the bulk of the systems are still done waterfall. And guess what? The budgets, right, where the money goes, is still done on a very multi-year planning cycle, right? The Defense Department, as the Admiral was talking about, has these 20-year cycles of platforms and has these 3 to 5 year kind of funding cycles. And so I think that fundamentally needs to change, is we need to bring some of this faster feedback cycle to the rest of government processes. And so that's where I think HR is one of those areas where we need to absolutely tackle, right? And so we tend to focus on technology and engineering and product and design. And I don't know if you saw the Department of Homeland Security is hiring now for designers. They have a big call out. I'm passionate about early career technologists. The US Digital Corps is hiring for early career technologists. But we're not really revolutionizing, modernizing, improving the HR function, right? And so if you said, well, what would inspire you to go back into public services? Like, maybe being an HR official of an agency, right? And actually going in and rewriting some of those descriptions, finding ways to hire faster, right? How do you kind of clear a lot of those blockers so that people can actually get that feedback and deliver capability better?
Awesome. That is a perfect segue into the panel on hacking HR in government. I want to thank Nick for participating. I think this is the start of an informal team, a different one that we may not have had before. I really want to thank you for being a part of it, being a thought leader in it. I encourage everybody to pick up this book, selfishly, because I'm in it. No. But it's fantastic what you're doing, and I hope you continue to stay in this space.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks.